Haneke's move into theatrical feature filmmaking happened more or less by accident. The Seventh Continent, which became Haneke's first theatrical feature and right away gave him critical success, was a film that was written originally for television. And the irony is that Haneke wrote this script for what at the time was probably the most liberal, or one might even say left-wing progressive network in Germany, Radio Bremen. But they turned down the script because they felt it was too dark and there was too much death in it. Haneke was distraught by this decision, but his producer, Veit Heiduschka, suggested to him that, well, if television doesn't want it, maybe this is the appropriate material for a theatrical feature. Haneke's TV films do form a fairly coherent body of work, but it is not exactly a copious body. Haneke, through the 70s and 80s, would be able to direct films only every 2 or 3 years. It was really his work for the theater that provided his main source of income, and it was his work as a stage director that also gave him his main professional reputation in Germany and in Austria. Making films for television had kind of a twofold effect on Haneke's career. On the one hand, it helped him stay on the radar of German and Austrian television stations. At the same time, it's also really important to keep in mind that Haneke in the 70s and 80s did not really have the kind of international or even national reputation that the directors of the new German cinema had, especially Fassbinder and Schlöndorff and Wenders and Herzog, who are the stars of the new German cinema. One reason for this was that Haneke's films had a different funding structure and a different production structure. So Haneke's films were all exclusively in-house productions made for television stations. They were commissioned by TV, they were financed by TV, and they were only ever shown on TV. For the new German cinema, television usually acted as a financial co-sponsor, and the deal was that a film project would gain a subsidy that would be administered through television, but then the films would be released theatrically first, and then television would have the right to show the films soon after. So the subsidy structure was really quite different. Haneke did not really emerge into the spotlight as a director who received state subsidies and would then have to test his films for a paying audience. There's also a basic cluster of broader themes that the television films share with Haneke's theatrical features from the 1990s. The decline of interpersonal relations in post-World War II European society, the curse of prosperity, in other words, the fact that post-World War II European society, after it got back on its feet, was able to prosper, but that did not lead to happiness among the people of Europe. In fact, a lot of the relationships depicted in Haneke films are characterized by what one might call European middle-class malaise. But Haneke actually put a spin on this topic of European malaise. The central conceptual term is glaciation, which he already anticipated in some of his television films, especially Lemmings, but which then became the focus of his first 3 theatrical features in the 1990s that also came to bear that term's name, the Glaciation Trilogy. The Glaciation Trilogy depicts human existence as a lifeless tedium in a completely administered and highly bureaucratized world, to use Adorno's description. Unlike the mainstream Hollywood films he had seen in the 1950s, especially Rebel Without a Cause, Haneke was not interested in depicting this intergenerational dysfunction in the register of melodrama. He wanted to focus on how a certain historical amnesia, a certain kind of parental dysfunction, traveled from the parents' generation to the children, and how the children actually came to bear the brunt of their parents' dysfunctions and their parents' inability to face the realities of their past and of their present. The depiction of violence and the problematization of violence in our society is a topic that straddles the television work and the later films. In general, Haneke is trying to work with and around the dilemma that how do you condemn the use of violence without actually showing violence? His theatrical features share some of the aesthetic devices of his television films, which already were different from conventional television films in their aspiration to use devices from art cinema. What Haneke now adds is a notable sparseness. These films all have a deliberately aesthetic look. They rely on the use of black leader to divide the scenes. The image is not characterized by pictorial beauty and by a richness or fullness, but quite the opposite. Oftentimes, the image looks sparse or deteriorated in some ways, or in some ways poor. Haneke relies heavily on the use of television footage in the Glaciation trilogy, but not only concrete footage, he also showcases the medium itself, the electronic visual medium, in a way that appears jarring in comparison to the clarity and the depth of the cinematic image. Haneke depicts television as both a social glue and a social divider. So it is something that, for better or worse, unites our modern world, but it is also always something that at the same time also divides our world. The films of the Glaciation trilogy do not convey a sense of visual abundance, but quite the opposite, of visual sparsity. In a limited time span, these films rotate through a very limited number of scenarios, of scenes, of angles, and of shot types. The films feature a limited number of settings. The social dynamics between the characters are highly recognizable. One might say they actually appear routine or rote.
Glaubst du nicht, dass es vielleicht sinnvollere Wege gibt zu protestieren?
The actual content or the actual meaning of these scenes emerges in between. It's not really contained within the contents of what is depicted, but the meaning lies just as much in the style and in the very repetitiveness of them. There are two aesthetic devices that come to prominence in the Glaciation trilogy. One is the close-up, and the other one is the long take. Especially the Seventh Continent becomes very striking for its use of extreme close-ups. The film begins with a series of extreme close-ups of body parts, of hands, feet, and also of objects that are being moved around. And it is up to us to try to relate these extreme close-ups to a larger environment. The other device that Haneke uses very deliberately is the long take. We think especially of the long take, for example, in Benny's video that shows the killing of the girl. And then, of course, as we know in Code Unknown, the long take is elevated to the main aesthetic feature of the film. Hanneke's relocation to France happened for very concrete reasons. He received a phone call from Juliette Binoche, who had seen his Glaciation trilogy and was very impressed with it and simply wanted to work with him. Hanneke decided that this would be an opportune moment to actually do a project in France. He got backing from a producer, moved to Paris for several months, and did a lot of research on Paris's many different socio-cultural demographics. Code Unknown has, of course, one thing in common with 71 Fragments of A Chronology of Chance. Both films are multi-strain narratives that have a large cast of characters, and Hanneke constructs many different stories for these characters, and the viewer is kind of tasked with finding out how and at what point these stories might intersect or converge or overlap. But the fragmentation in each case has quite a different connotation and a different thrust. 71 Fragments is a film that divides its different fragments very ostentatiously through blank leader. And the individual fragments themselves look very static, which gives the overall impression that these fragments are part of a larger body, but have been almost ripped out of this body and can't quite come back together. So there is a sense of violence and a sense of destruction in the aesthetic of the film itself. Code Unknown is quite different, and the reason for that is that the scenes themselves are filmed in very dynamic long takes where the camera is characterized through very fluid movements. So while 71 Fragments can be characterized as a modernist work in which fragmentation sort of takes on this sense of damage, Code Unknown can be characterized perhaps more as a postmodern work in which is more willing to embrace the idea of fragmentation as the status of our contemporary world. Hanneke considerably expands the cast of characters away from just focusing on white European bourgeois first world urban characters to shifting more towards people coming from Africa, people coming from Eastern Europe. It has been said that at least in Code Unknown, you have a sense that if Hanneke doesn't really fully disturb these different categories, he certainly puts them into question. He certainly questions, implicitly questions the implications of European integration. He thematizes the consequences resulting from the fall of the Iron Curtain. The story that tracks the woman from the Eastern Bloc who travels to Paris to basically be a beggar on the streets assumes a poignancy that I personally don't see in a lot of films during this period. So in that sense, I do think Hanneke makes a good effort of trying to relate these different geopolitical identities to one another. What I think is most striking about the camera work in Code Unknown is the drama with which the camera work is infused. There are many different ways in which to construct a long take. There are different ways in which to do a tracking shot. What is notable about Hanneke's camera in this film is that it tries to follow not simply one particular person, but ends up feeling compelled to follow multiple characters, and of course ends up failing to do so in the process, because that's one thing that a camera cannot do. It cannot split itself in half. So the effect is that the camera becomes a little bit hysterical. It certainly becomes restless, but I like to look at it as almost like a hysterical parent or a hysterical eyewitness that comes upon a certain scene and tries to follow its details, but then the details kind of disperse, and the camera essentially doesn't know which detail to follow. But this is also something that the camera very self-consciously theatricalizes. So the camera sort of takes on this voice of, I wish I could pay attention to all of you, but I really can't. For me, Coda Non is a meditation on witnessing. The long take, in general, is used in that film to simulate the role of the eyewitness. In the subway scene, this long take becomes very dramatic because it is a situation that many of us may have experienced ourselves. So I feel, in a way, the scene has a very deliberate psychological impact because it wants to recreate a situation familiar to many of us. But I think it's also an aesthetic meditation on the question of what does it actually mean to witness something like this. And one thing that has always fascinated me about the scene, and people don't really comment on it too much, is not only its extended length and the fact that it's a static shot, but also the fact that actually the camera is not really at the height of a person who stands. The camera is actually a little bit lower. And I believe that this relates to the camera position of Binoche's boyfriend, the war photographer, who also goes on the subway and takes photos of people surreptitiously. So one of the questions becomes, how do we relate this type of activity that is performed by him to this scene that we witness with the young Arab man? So there are different nuances in which the scenes in which the film shows Anne, the character of Anne, played by Binoche, doing her work as an actress, how these function.
Vous entendez ce sifflement? Ça vient du plafond. Bientôt vous allez sentir l'odeur.
And we have the scene in the room that she seems to be entrapped in, which is quite a tense scene and actually has the feeling of a suspense thriller. It's very claustrophobic. But then it turns out that it actually is part of her work, of the film that she's working on. I think where Haneke toys with us even more is in the swimming pool scene. But that scene, I think, is shot in a very clearly in a way that is highly incongruous with the style of the film, because it's a classic narrative scene shot in Hollywood style with a shot reverse shot, the kind of angles he uses, the sort of lighting he uses. It's a very commercial type of moment, and the way it panders to the audience with the child standing up on the railing of the balcony. When that ends, we realize that it is a film within the film. I think the effect is clear. It's something that, you know, where Haneke is saying, well, you should have known this all along, because, you know, this is a totally different way of giving you images, of putting images together. But it does relate back to the question of how do we relate to images, whether they're long takes, whether they're photographs of war-torn areas, or these Hollywood-type moments. The film is actually quite heterogeneous in the variety of visual aesthetics that it serves up. And I think it's sort of supposed to serve as a training ground for us to question this idea that we're simply immediate, impartial witnesses, and instead make us aware that every viewer, every witness is always already implicated in the kind of image that they're viewing, whether it's a commercial image, whether it's a seemingly uncommercial image. There are always, conditions of implication.
Des éléments descriptifs, des faits anecdotiques qui jouent justement sur l'ambiguïté de ce mot abstraction. L'abstraction pour lui n'est pas quelque chose qui exclut.
When Haneke then switches to a more intimate setting, showing us her ironing in her own apartment and getting this sense that there's something bad going on next door, this is when Binoche sort of does her best work, and we're dealing with the character. At the same time, I feel the very fact that Haneke, with Code Unknown, for the first time uses a star, says something. I believe that what Binoche brings to the film, not only as an actress but as a star, is a certain fluidity, the way she actually does mediate between these scenes of her being Anne and the scenes in which Anne is slipping into a role and playing a character. One thing that gives Code Unknown continued relevancy is its depiction of the situation of refugees. It's the fact that it shows that refugees are humans, that they suffer unduly, and that no matter what their exact motives are for coming to a Western European country, the kinds of hardships that they willingly incur in order to get there already justifies their existence and their right to exist as dignified citizens in that new environment. And this is something that Europe still struggles mightily with today. So I think that there is a way in which the film, no matter ultimately how hierarchical it still is with regard to a kind of like a Eurocentric hierarchy of characters, it still, I think, is very effective in lending dignity to these refugees and to their situations. And it shows that very skillfully with two different case studies, the African family on the one hand, and then the Eastern European woman. And with the Eastern European woman, you might easily argue, well, is it really necessary for her to go all the way to France and sit on the street and beg? But then as her story develops, I think the film argues that it doesn't matter. The very fact that she's taken it upon herself to do this and to do this for her family, and that she makes multiple attempts and she gets kicked out and then she comes right back, is something that really questions the idea of who is a European citizen, who has the right to feel entitled to be this European citizen.